This brings us finally to one last type of dominant chord, the applied dominant, and its root is based on the second letter of our scale. If you look at the staff, you'll be able to see why, even though initially it may seem a little bit confusing. The dominant, if you recall, was so called as the fifth note of our scale because it was the second most defining key and the second most stable key in our entire scale next to home base, which was our tonic, the first degree of scale. So the dominant of the dominant would naturally be the fifth note, with that being the base. So it would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Here is our dominant. And the dominant of the dominant would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 to the B, which is the second note of our scale. I'd like you to listen to this on the keyboard though, and you'll hear that special relationship between the tonic and the dominant, and we'll do that in the key of A major. Here we have A, and the dominant is E. We could take other notes and see how they sound, and would they actually define it as well. They really don't. If we put all that back into the context of the dominant, you can hear why it is so called. Now, there's something very interesting about this note, the second note of our scale, which actually also applies to the seventh note of our scale, so the one above the tonic or the one below the tonic. This is even something reflected in the actual names which are given to them, like the name that we give to the fifth note as our dominant. Let's think about our solar system for a second. The center of our solar system would be our tonic. It's the biggest object that's there. The second largest object would be Jupiter, and that's the dominant. As we know, in space, large objects which contain a lot of mass also have a lot of gravitational pull to them. And you can't get much bigger than the sun, our tonic key. So the notes which are around it are really in quite a tight orbit, and when we hear them, we think of them almost exclusively as being close to home. In fact, they even give us an impetus to getting home. That's how close they are. So when we talk about their names, that's reflected in the name that's given to them. The second note of our scale is above the tonic. It is called the supertonic, super being above. And the seventh note is called the leading note. It leads into the tonic. Now, if we listen to the descending scale that I have here in A major, thinking of the last note, A, as being our tonic, you'll be able to hear the relationship of the notes as we move from the second to the tonic, or if we sort of move around, these are actually called incomplete neighbor notes in musical terms, doing a 2-7-1 or a 7-2-1. Could you hear how in each of those instances there was this sort of a driving force that brought us back? And once we reached our tonic, number 1 or A, we sort of wanted to stay there. That's how stable it was. It did really feel like home. Let's listen to that relationship of the dominant to the dominant, and then the dominant seventh of the dominant, and how that sounds in relation to each other. An interesting fact, though, is that the dominant seventh, which is built upon the second, that is the V7 of V, although it is based upon the second note of the scale, does not necessarily mean that we want to go back home to A. Part of that is because the dominant of the dominant means that our ear can actually hear its relationship to its origin if it's in the right musical context. Let's listen to this piece called The Song of Twilight, and we'll actually be able to hear that. As we're going along, look at the bottom, and you'll be able to see the markings that I've put in here in terms of the vertical harmonies. Now, some of these actually are harmonies draw upon the treble clef. For instance, we have a B here, which is then added into the bottom. So this actually becomes our V7 here. So just look at those notes, and you'll actually be able to see as well that when we think of it in these terms, in these harmonic terms of tonality, where everything is defined by the key of origin, that we're moving mostly between our tonic chords, our dominant chords, a dominant of the dominant, and sometimes we actually have a sixth chord. But for the most part, that is not the case. You'll also be able to hear that we are moving in a stepwise fashion in a couple of ways, that there is sort of a key progression here, and that's happening in two ways. We'll actually listen to this in greater detail when we section off the left hand from the right hand, because we do have a treble clef here, so we can't speak in terms of bass and treble. But what I've done for the right hand is you'll see these notes here, which are creating our driving force. The 6-5, 6-5 to 3, 3 to 2, 2 to 1 is our home. And you can hear that descending drive to home. But once we get there, we don't linger that much. We actually jump back up onto the 6 and back down to the 5. Well, that's interesting because here actually mirrors back here. So this reintroduces the theme that we had before, and then we continue on and we can see that it continues down again with like the 6-5, but I've noted the 5 here, 3, 2, and 1 to the end. Now, if we look at the harmonies that go with that, so that's the sort of progression of the key structure that we can see within that. And we can also talk about the metrical emphasis that we saw in lesson number 7, where in 4/4 time, our first beat is the strongest beat, but our third beat is always the second strongest. Here we have a lot of stability that's happening. We have it on the 3rd, and we have it on the 5th and the 3rd. With the 2-2-1, there's that driving force to come back down. Again, 2-2-1 here. But we do have a lot of stability. It has to be that tension, though, arises actually to keep moving on away from the points of stability in our bass. Because if we look at actually what's happening down here with the lowest note, the bass note, we see that we're actually going through a complete descending scale almost. We go from a 1, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, back to the 1. But we're now moving into the bass clef. And we continue down, 7, 6, 5. The 4-5 is almost like a neighboring note that brings us back up because that's our dominant. And then we go from the dominant back to the 1. We have our 7th note, our leading note, which is like our neighbor note that brings us back again. So when we listen to this entire piece, you'll actually be able to hear all of that rather very clearly. Just keep an eye on how you're hearing it and how everything moves in a very fluid way. An interesting thing there as well that happened, I'm not sure if you've noticed it, was that when we got to the 3 here, there was a sense of stability as well. We talked about that descending sort of a tension that was building because we had the anticipation that we were continuing to go down. But if you look at what chords we actually have in terms of the harmonics, we did have a 1 there, but we didn't have a root 1 like we have here. So when you listen to the beginning, and you listen to how it starts over again and you come to the end, that's where you hear a lot of the stability. We are introduced on stability, we close on stability. But that 1/6 chord that's there, and that 1/6 chord that's there, really just give us a sense that, you know what, it's not quite right. Let's give a listen to that and listening just to the right hand and to the left hand. We'll start with the left hand first. Could you hear in that section that as we got into this one part here that transitioned us back to the repeat of the opening themes, although the left hand had descended further an octave lower and had also increased from simply having an interval to having an actual chord, you could hear that movement from the 5 to the 1, from the 2 to the 1 as well. And there was that impetus to get back there in this context. Let's listen to the melody itself now and see how that sounds. You can hear that natural descent, but that sense of incompletion as I talked here, and how that really does echo the reintroduction of the original theme and where we started off in the A section. I hope this has been helpful for you in understanding a bit of the aspects of applied dominance, and triads in your understanding of this idea of structural hearing, of understanding what's happening in the piece so that we can give ourselves a verbal description, because then instead of simply relying upon the notes by names, when we put them into a context, that's what gives it meaning. Other videos will be coming up as well in the future. I hope you've enjoyed those. Feel free to leave a comment if you wish, and parents, if you have any questions, please do contact me.